The morning mist clung to the stone walls of St. Benedict's Abbey like the very breath of angel, yet my heart harbored thoughts most unholy. My name is Brother Thomas, and though I speak these words now as a man weathered by trials most grievous, I was but 20 summers old when first I donned the rough brown habit of. The year was that of our Lord 1347, in the wild lands beyond the great ocean, where our brethren had built sanctuaries amidst forests that stretched endless as God's mercy. I remember well that dawn when I knelt before the altar, my knees pressed against cold stone that seemed to draw the very warmth from my bones. The chapel stood shrouded in shadow, save where shafts of golden light pierced the stained glass windows, painting the floor in hues of ruby and sapphire. The sweet perfume of burning incense filled my nostrils, mixing with the earthen scent of ancient stones and the lingering aroma of beeswax candles that had burned through the night. Dost thou, Thomas of Ashford, promise to serve our Lord in poverty, chastity, and obedience unto thy final breath? The voice that spoke these sacred words belonged to Abbot Matthias, and though I gazed upon the crucifix before me, I felt his eyes upon my bent head like flames that would consume my very soul. I do so promise, with all that I am, and all that I shall ever be, I whispered, my voice barely audible above the soft chanting of my brother monks who surrounded us in their circle of devotion. Yet even as I spoke these holy vows, even as I felt the rough wool of the habit settle upon my shoulders like a mantle of righteousness, I could not banish the memory of those eyes, dark as midnight pools, filled with an intensity that spoke of hungers I dared not name. Abbot Matthias was a man of perhaps 40 years, though the exact count remained shrouded in mystery, as did much of his past before joining our brotherhood. His hair, once golden as wheat fields beneath summer sun, now bore threads of silver at the temples, and his face was carved with lines that spoke of prayers offered in the deep watches of night and burdens carried in silence. When he smiled, which was rare indeed, it was as if the very sun had broken through storm clouds. Yet when his countenance grew stern, even the boldest among us would lower their eyes and hasten to their duties. The days that followed my ordination passed in the rhythm that had governed abbey life since time immemorial. We rose while stars still wheeled overhead, our bells calling us to matins in voices that echoed across the valley like the songs of seraphim. The chapel would fill with brothers moving like shadows, their faces pale and drawn with sleep, yet their voices strong as they lifted ancient hymns toward heaven's vault. After prayer came the breaking of our fast, simple fare of bread baked in our own ovens, honey from our hives, and goat's milk warm from the udder. We ate in silence, as was our custom, listening only to the voice of Brother Francis, as he read from the lives of saints, tales of martyrdom and miracle that should have filled my heart with holy fire. Instead, I found my gaze drawn again and again to where the abbot sat at the high table, his strong hands breaking bread with the same careful precision he brought to all his tasks. My duties in those first weeks were simple ones, befitting a novice still learning the ways of our brotherhood. I tended the herb garden, where lavender and rosemary grew beneath the protective shadow of the abbey walls, their fragrance rising sweet and clean in the morning air. I copied manuscripts in the scriptorium, my quill scratching across parchment as I illuminated the holy words with paints mixed from clay and gold, my fingers stained with colors bright as jewels. I scrubbed stone floors until they gleamed. I swept dust from corners where spiders spun their silver webs. I carried water from the well, whose depths reflected only darkness. Yet through all these humble labors, I remained aware always of his presence. When Abbot Matthias walked the corridors, his footsteps rang against stone with authority absolute, and brothers would bow their heads as he passed. Murmuring greetings he acknowledged with the slightest nod. His voice, when raised in prayer or instruction, carried notes both commanding and gentle, like distant thunder that promised either storm or blessed rain. I told myself that my awareness of him stemmed only from proper respect for one chosen by God to lead us. Yet my heart whispered truths my mind refused to acknowledge. The first moment of true recognition between us came on a morning when autumn had begun to paint the forest in shades of flame and gold. I had risen early to tend the herb garden before lauds, believing myself alone beneath the pale dawn sky. The morning air carried the crisp promise of winter's approach, and dew sparkled upon the leaves like tears of heaven. I was bent over a patch of sage, my hands dark with rich earth, when I heard footsteps approach across the courtyard stone. Brother Thomas. His voice spoke my name with such gentleness that I startled, nearly dropping my basket of gathered herbs. I turned to find Abbot Matthias standing not 3 paces away, his dark robes blending with the shadows cast by the eastern wall. The early light caught the silver threading his hair and illuminated his eyes with warmth I had not expected to find there. My Lord Abbot. I struggled to my feet, brushing soil from my habit while fighting the urge to flee like a startled. Forgive me, I did not know thou wouldst be abroad at such an hour. The garden calls to me in these quiet moments before the day's duties claim us all, he replied, stepping closer to examine the herbs I had gathered. His nearness filled my senses with the scent of his skin, clean as rain-washed stone, touched with the lingering fragrance of the sandalwood soap our infirmarian prepared for the abbey's use. Thou hast a gentle touch with growing Brother Francis speaks well of thy work here. Heat rose in my cheeks at his praise, though I could not have said whether from pleasure or shame. I find peace in this labor, my lord. The earth reminds us that all things spring from God's creative love and return to him in their proper season. He nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed upon my face with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. Indeed, young Thomas, yet sometimes I wonder if God does not plant desires within our hearts that seem to war against his holy law. Tell me, dost thou ever feel such conflict within thy breast? The question struck me like lightning from a clear sky. For how could he know of the storms that raged within my soul? I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again, unable to form words that would not betray me utterly. In that moment of silence, something passed between us, a recognition perhaps, or an acknowledgement of truths too dangerous to speak aloud. I sometimes struggle to understand the ways of providence, I managed at last. But surely our faith must guide us through all shadows, must it not? Surely it must. Yet something in his voice suggested that faith alone might not prove sufficient armor against the battle's waste. He reached past me to pluck a sprig of lavender, holding it to his nose and breathing deep of its perfume. This herb is said to calm troubled thoughts and ease the torments of those who cannot sleep. Perhaps thou shouldst keep some by thy bedside, Brother Thomas. With those words he turned and walked away, leaving me alone with my racing heart and the growing certainty that I was not the only one whose nights were haunted by desires that dared not speak their. In the days that followed, I found myself seeking excuses to be where he might pass, to catch glimpses of him as he moved through his duties with grace that seemed almost otherworldly. During the singing of the hours, I would position myself where I might watch his profile as he led our voices in ancient melodies, noting how the candlelight played across the strong line of his jaw, and the way his lips shaped each sacred. When he preached from the pulpit on Sundays, I hung upon every word, not for their spiritual wisdom, though that was great indeed, but for the music of his voice as it filled the chapel's vaulted space. I began to take more care with my appearance, though such vanity ran counter to every precept of our order. I would linger longer at my morning ablutions, ensuring that my face was clean-shaven and my hair lay neatly beneath my tonsure. I mended small rips in my habit before I might have, and I took to washing it more frequently than strict necessity required. These small rebellions against the spirit of our vows filled me with shame, yet I could no more cease them than I could stop the sun from rising each morn. The season turned deeper into autumn, and with it came preparations for the Feast of All Saints, when pilgrims would journey to our abbey to venerate the relics housed within our walls. Brother Francis, as keeper of the altar vessels and sacred ornaments, directed a great cleaning and polishing that left every surface gleaming. I found myself assigned to work in the treasury, a small chamber adjoining the sacristy where our most precious objects were stored. It was there, surrounded by chalices of silver and gold, by candlesticks wrought with angels' wings, and reliquaries set with gems that captured light like captured rainbows, that I encountered the abbot in circumstances that would change the course of both our lives forever. I was alone, carefully cleaning a paten that had been crafted in distant lands, when I heard the heavy wooden door swing open behind me. Brother Thomas. His voice came soft as silk in the treasure chamber's hushed atmosphere. I had not expected to find thee here at this hour. I turned, the golden paten still gleaming in my hands, and found him silhouetted in the doorway like an image from an illuminated manuscript. The afternoon light streaming through the chamber's single window struck him from behind, creating a nimbus around his form that made him appear almost angelic, yet the expression in his dark eyes spoke of very earthly concern. Brother Francis bid me complete the polishing of these vessels before eventide, I explained, setting the paten carefully upon its silk-draped shelf. I thought to work more quickly in solitude, away from the preparations in the main church. He stepped into the chamber and closed the door behind him, the sound of the latch falling into place seeming unnaturally loud in the enclosed space. We were alone now, surrounded by objects sacred and beautiful, yet the holiness of the place seemed only to heighten the awareness that crackled between us like flame between tinder and spark. Thou dost work with great reverence for these holy things, he observed, moving to stand beside me before the treasury's shelves. His nearness made my hands tremble as I reached for another vessel, a chalice carved from a single piece of amber that glowed like captured sunlight. It is a gift not granted to all men, this ability to touch sacred objects and imbue them with something of one's own spirit. My lord speaks too kindly of my humble efforts, I replied. though his words sent warmth spreading through my chest like wine. These treasures deserve far better care than my unworthy hands can provide. Nay, Thomas. And here he did something that sent shock through my very bones. He placed his hand upon mine where I held the amber chalice, his fingers warm against my skin, his touch gentle yet firm with an authority I could not resist. Thy hands are blessed, as are all things that serve our Lord with pure intent. Yet tell me true, what dost thou see when thou lookest upon this cup? I gazed down at the chalice, acutely aware of his hand covering mine, of the way his breath stirred the air between us. The amber vessel seemed to pulse with inner light, its surface smooth as silk beneath my palm. I see beauty beyond measure, I whispered. Beauty that speaks of divine love made manifest in earthly form. And dost thou believe that God creates beauty solely to be admired from afar? His voice had grown softer still, barely above a whisper, and I felt, rather than saw him lean closer. Or might he intend for his creatures to know such beauty intimately, to touch it, and be touched by it in return? The question hung between us like incense smoke, heavy with meaning I hardly dared interpret. I raised my eyes to meet his gaze and found there a hunger that mirrored my own, a longing that spoke of sleepless nights and prayers, offered not for strength to resist temptation, but for courage to embrace it. My lord abbot, I breathed, my voice catching in my throat. What dost thou ask of me? Nothing that thou art not willing to give freely. His free hand rising to cup my cheek with such tenderness that tears sprang unbidden to my eyes. Yet everything that I have prayed for these many weeks since, first I looked upon thy face, and knew that God had sent either my salvation or my damnation, walking through our gates. Time seemed suspended in that golden, as though the very angels held their breath to witness what would pass between us. I could feel the warmth of his palm against my skin, could see the way the afternoon light played across his features, could breathe the scent of him that had haunted my dreams. The amber chalice in our joined hands seemed to burn with inner fire, a physical manifestation of the passion that threatened to consume us both. I have tried to pray away these feelings, I confessed, my words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I have fasted until my body weakened. I have knelt upon cold stone until my knees bled. I have begged our Lord to free me from this torment of wanting what I cannot have. Yet still I dream of thee. Still I find reasons to be where thou might pass. Still my heart races like a hunted stag's whenever thou dost speak my— And I, he whispered, his thumb tracing across my cheekbone with reverence usually reserved for sacred relics, have stood at my window in the depths of night, watching thy cell and wondering if thou dost lie wakeful as do I, wrestling with desires that mock our holy vows. I have offered my suffering to God as penance for wanting, yet I begin to wonder if perhaps he means for us to find in each other a different sort of sacrament. Before I could form any reply to these words that turned my understanding of divine will upon its head, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to mine with such gentle reverence that it seemed less a kiss than a benediction. The amber chalice slipped from our hands to rest upon its shelf as we came together in an embrace that felt both like the deepest sin and the most perfect prayer I had ever offered. His mouth was warm against mine, tasting of the mint leaves he chewed to sweeten his breath, and I felt as though I were drowning in sensation too intense for my mortal frame to contain. My hands rose of their own accord to tangle in his hair, finding it softer than I had imagined in my most secret fantasies, while his arms encircled me with strength that spoke of protection rather than possession. When at last we broke apart, both of us breathing as though we had run great distances, he rested his forehead against mine, while his hands framed my face like a chalice too precious to release. "Have we done?" I whispered, though part of me already knew that I would not take back this moment, even if all the powers of heaven and earth offered me the chance. "We have tasted of fruit that may prove our paradise or our exile from grace," he replied, his voice rough with emotion I had never heard him express before. "Yet I find I care not whit, so long as I might taste of it again." The sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor beyond forced us to spring apart like guilty children, though the look that passed between us promised that this was but the beginning of our fall from grace. He smoothed his robes with hands that trembled slightly, while I busied myself with the remaining vessels, trying to calm the racing of my pulse. Brother Francis entered with his usual cheerful demeanor, praising our diligent work in the treasury, and speaking of preparations still to be completed before the feast day's ceremony. Yet I could barely hear his words over the thundering of my heart, and I noticed how the abbot's eyes lingered upon my face with an intensity that made my cheeks burn. That night, I lay upon my narrow cot staring at the ceiling while moonlight painted silver patterns across the stone walls of my cell. Sleep fled from me as though it too had been scandalized by the afternoon's events, and I found myself reliving every moment of our encounter, the warmth of his hand upon mine, the gentleness of his kiss, the way he had looked at me as though I were something precious beyond measure. What manner of monk was I, that I could find such joy in what should have brought only shame? What sort of servant of God could feel his presence more keenly in a moment of forbidden intimacy than in all my hours of prayer and meditation? Yet even as these questions tormented me, I knew with certainty that I would seek him out again, that I would risk not only my vows but my very soul, for the chance to know once more the paradise I had glimpsed in his arm. The feast day dawned clear and bright, with a crispness to the air that spoke of winter's swift approach. Pilgrims began arriving while the morning mist still clung to the valley floor, their voices raised in hymns of praise as they climbed the winding path to our gates. By the hour of terce, our chapel was filled to overflowing with the faithful come to venerate our relics and receive the blessing of our community. I moved through my duties like one caught in a dream, helping to direct the pilgrims to their proper places, assisting with the display of sacred vessels now gleaming from our recent labor. Yet through it all, I remained acutely aware of the abbot's presence, of the way his voice rose above the congregation as he led the ancient liturgy, of how his hands moved with practiced grace as he elevated the consecrated host. It was during the singing of Vespers that our eyes met across the crowded chapel, and I saw in his gaze the same hunger that gnawed at my own soul. The psalm we sang spoke of divine love that surpassed all understanding, yet the love I read in his expression was thoroughly earthly, weighted with promise, and dark with need. I felt heat rise in my face, and had to look away lest others notice the communion that passed between us in that sacred space. As the day's celebrations drew to a close and the pilgrims began to depart for whatever lodging they could find in the surrounding villages, I found myself assigned to assist with securing the treasury's precious content. The irony was not lost upon me that I should return to the scene of our first transgression, and my hands shook as I carefully wrapped each vessel in its protective silk. I was alone in the chamber when he appeared in the doorway, his dark robes making him seem part of the evening shadows that crept through the abbey's corridor. This time he did not speak, did not offer words that might be overheard by any who passed. Instead, he simply entered and closed the door behind him, his eyes never leaving mine as he crossed to where I stood among the treasures. "I have thought of nothing but thee since yesterday's events," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of confession. "I have prayed for strength to resist this madness that has overtaken us both, yet I find prayer avails me nothing when faced with thy presence. And what wouldst thou have of me, my lord?" I asked, though I already knew the answer in the desperate beating of my heart. "What wouldst thou have us become?" "I would have us be what we are, two souls who have found in each other something that transcends the boundaries of flesh and spirit," he replied, reaching out to take my hands in his own. "I know not what God's will may be in this matter, yet I cannot believe that love, even such love as ours, can be wholly contrary to his divine plan." He drew me into his embrace with infinite care, as though I were made of spun glass, and might shatter at rough handling. This time when his lips found mine, there was nothing hesitant about the kiss. It spoke of hunger long denied, of barriers finally breached, of surrender to forces greater than either of our wills could master. My arms went around his neck as naturally as rivers flow toward the sea, and I felt the solid strength of his body pressed against mine through the rough wool of our habits. He was warmth and safety and completion altogether, everything I had never known I needed until this moment when I could no longer imagine existing without it. When we broke apart, both breathing hard, he rested his chin atop my head, while his hands stroked through my hair with reverence that made me tremble. "What are we to do, Thomas?" he whispered into the gathering darkness. "How are we to live with this fire that burns between us, yet maintain the vows that bind us to this holy place?" "I know not," I admitted, clinging to him as though he alone could anchor me in a world suddenly turned upside down. "I know only that I cannot go back to what I was before, cannot pretend that what passes between us is anything less than transformation of my very soul." We held each other in silence as night settled fully around the abbey, listening to the distant sound of Compline being sung in the chapel, voices raised in the final prayers of the day. The irony of our position was not lost on either of us. Here we stood in the treasury surrounded by objects sacred to our faith, committing what our vows declared to be the gravest of sins, yet feeling closer to divine grace than ever before in our religious life. "Meet me tomorrow night," he said suddenly, his voice urgent, "in the garden, by the well, when the hour of matins has passed and all others sleep. I must speak with thee more freely than these stolen moments allow." I nodded against his shoulder, not trusting my voice to remain steady. When he finally released me and stepped back, I felt the cold rush in to fill the space where his warmth had, a physical reminder of how empty my life would be without his presence to give it meaning. The following day passed with agonizing slowness, each hour stretching like eternity as I moved through my appointed tasks, while my mind dwelt solely upon the promise of our midnight. I found myself starting at every sound, jumping when brothers spoke my name, unable to concentrate on the simplest duties. Brother Francis remarked upon my distraction with gentle concern, asking if I felt unwell or troubled by some spiritual matter he might help resolve. "'Tis nothing, good brother," I assured him, though the lie sat bitter on my tongue. "Merely the changing season affecting my humors. All will be well with rest and prayer." Yet when the hour of Compline arrived and we gathered in the chapel for the day's final prayers, I could focus on nothing but the abbot's presence at the front of our congregation. He led the ancient words with his usual dignity, yet I fancied I could hear in his voice an undertone of anticipation that matched my own. When our eyes met during the singing of the final psalm, the look that passed between us was weighted with such promise that I feared others must surely notice. After the prayers concluded and my brothers began filing silently toward their cells, I lingered in the chapel pretending to pray, while actually watching the minutes creep by on the great clock that marked the canonical hours. When finally the abbey settled into the deep quiet that preceded matin, I slipped from my cell and made my way through corridors silver with moonlight toward the garden, where I found him standing beside the well, his figure dark against the pale stone, his face turned up toward stars that wheeled in their eternal dance across the heavens. At the sound of my approach, he turned, and even in the uncertain light I could see the relief that flooded his features. "I feared thou might not come," he admitted, extending his hand toward me. "I feared that daylight and reflection might have cooled the fire that burns between us." "Never," I replied, taking his hand and feeling the now familiar jolt of connection that passed between us at even the simplest touch. "If anything, the hours of waiting have only made me more certain that what we share transcends the boundaries of this earthly existence." He led me to a stone bench carved into the garden wall, a place sheltered from casual observation by the drooping branches of an ancient willow tree. There, with moonlight filtering through the leaves to paint patterns of silver and shadow across our faces, he spoke words that would forever alter the course of both our lives. "Thomas, I have wrestled with angels and demons both since first I acknowledged the feelings that consume me when I look upon thee. I have searched the scriptures for guidance, have prostrated myself before the altar until my knees bled, have begged God to show me his will in this matter that seems to defy all holy law. And what answer has heaven given thee?" I asked, though I scarcely dared hope for any response that might justify the path we seemed determined to walk. "No voice has spoken from burning bush or whirlwind," he replied with a smile that held more sadness than joy. "Yet I begin to think that perhaps the answer lies not in scripture or revelation, but in the very fact that such love as ours can exist at all. Is it not possible that God, in his infinite wisdom, sometimes places within our hearts desires that call us to a different sort of service than we had planned?" I felt my breath catch at words, for they echoed thoughts I had barely dared formulate in my most secret meditations. "Dost thou mean to suggest that our love might itself be a form of prayer, a way of knowing the divine that transcends the boundaries of conventional devotion?" "I mean to suggest that love, true love, such as I feel for thee, cannot be holy, no matter what the church fathers might decree," he said, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "When I hold thee in my arms, when I look into thy eyes and see my own soul reflected there, I feel closer to God's presence than I have ever felt in all my years of Orthodox worship." These were dangerous words, thoughts that bordered on heresy, yet they resonated in my heart with the clear ring of truth. For was it not written that God is love, and he who dwells in love dwells in God? How then could love itself, even love that defied conventional boundaries, be anything but sacred? "Then what wouldst thou have us do?" Leaning closer until our shoulders touched, and I could feel the warmth of his body through the coarse wool of our habits. "How shall we honor both this love and our commitment to the religious life we have chosen? I know not," his hand finding mine in the darkness. "I know only that I cannot continue to pretend indifference when my very soul cries out for thy presence. Perhaps we might find ways to be together that do not entirely violate our vows, moments stolen from the world's scrutiny where we might know the comfort of each other's company." It was hardly a perfect solution, this suggestion of clandestine meetings and hidden affections, yet it offered hope where before I had seen only the prospect of lifelong torment. "And if we are discovered? If others begin to suspect the nature of what passes between us? Then we shall face whatever consequences come with the knowledge that we have chosen love over fear, truth over convention," he replied, lifting our joined hands to press his lips against my knuckles. "I have lived too many years in the shadow of what others expect, Thomas. I would know, before God calls me home, what it means to love without reservation or shame." The weeks that followed our midnight conversation passed in a haze of stolen moments and hidden glances, each day bringing new opportunities for brief encounters that fed the fire burning between us while never fully satisfying the hunger He would find reasons to assign me tasks that brought me near his quarters, or would appear in whatever part of the abbey where I labored, always with some legitimate purpose that concealed his true motive. We developed an elaborate language of signs and subtle communications. A particular way of holding his hands during prayer that told me to meet him after compline, a certain hymn chosen for our singing that conveyed his longing when words could not be safely spoken aloud. I learned to read the finest changes in his expression, to interpret the slightest variations in his tone when he spoke my name in the presence of others. Our stolen moments together took on the quality of sacred ritual, each kiss a communion, each embrace a prayer of gratitude for the miracle of finding love in so unlikely a place. We would meet in the garden when weather permitted, or in the library's furthest alcove when winter storms raged beyond the abbey walls, or sometimes in the treasury where it all began, surrounded by objects of beauty that seemed to bless our union rather than condemn it. Yet even as we grew more skilled at concealing our affair from casual observation, I began to notice changes in the behavior of some among our brotherhood. Brother Marcus, a stern man given to much fasting and fierce devotion, began watching me with suspicion during our communal prayers. Brother Paul, keeper of our scriptorium, made comments about the dangers of particular friendships that I feared carried meaning beyond their surface intent. Most troubling of all was the behavior of Brother Simon, a man near my own age who had long harbored what I now recognized as romantic feelings for the abbot. His jealousy manifested itself in increasingly pointed questions about my duties and whereabouts, in lingering stares that made my skin crawl in a general attitude of hostility that grew more pronounced with each passing day. I shared my concerns with the abbot during one of our midnight meetings, as we sat together in the shadow of the bell tower, while winter wind howled around the abbey's stones. He listened with growing seriousness, as I detailed the various signs of suspicion I had observed, his face grave in the pale starlight. Brother Simon has indeed grown troublesome, he admitted when I had finished my recitation. Only yesterday he approached me with thinly veiled accusations regarding the time I spend in thy company. I deflected his concerns as best I could, but I fear his jealousy may soon drive him to more direct action. What manner of action? I asked, though I dreaded to hear the answer. He might well approach Father Prior with his suspicions, or even write to the bishop if he believes the situation warrants such extreme measures, the abbot replied, his arm tightening around my shoulders where we sat pressed together for warmth. Once such accusations are formally made, there would be little choice but to conduct an investigation that would surely reveal the truth of what passes between us. The thought of facing ecclesiastical judgment for our love sent cold dread through, for I knew well the fate that awaited those found guilty of such transgressions. At best, we might expect expulsion from our order and lifelong disgrace. At worst, particularly if the authorities chose to view our relationship as a corruption of sacred vows, we might face imprisonment or even death. Perhaps we should cease these meetings, I suggested, though the words felt like poison on my tongue. Perhaps 'twould be wiser to return to what we were before, to bury these feelings beneath the weight of our religious duties. Couldst thou truly do such a thing? He asked, turning to study my face in the dim light. Couldst thou look upon me each day and pretend that I am nothing more to thee than any other brother in Christ? Couldst thou watch me lead our prayers and bless our bread and perform all the duties of my office while feeling naught but proper religious respect? I tried to imagine such an existence, tried to picture myself returning to the hollow observances that had comprised my life before our love awakened, and found the prospect more terrifying than any earthly punishment. I cannot, I whispered. God help me, but I cannot. Nor can I, he replied, pressing his lips to my temple with infinite tenderness. Whatever the cost, Thomas, I would rather live one day as thy beloved than a lifetime as merely thy superior in faith. Yet even as we pledged ourselves anew to love despite the growing dangers, events were moving beyond our control. Brother Simon's jealousy had indeed driven him to desperate measures, though we would not learn of his betrayal until it was too late to prevent the catastrophe that followed. The revelation came on a morning when snow lay thick upon the abbey grounds and our breath showed white in the frigid air of the chapel. We had gathered for the singing of prime, voices raised in the ancient psalms that welcomed each new day, when Father Prior entered with a face grave as carved stone. Behind him walked two figures I recognized with growing horror as representatives of the bishop's court, men whose presence here could mean only one thing. Brothers, Father Prior announced, his voice carrying the weight of judgment already pronounced, we have received accusations of grave misconduct that require immediate investigation. Brother Thomas of Ashford and our Lord Abbot Matthias will accompany these good officers to answer questions regarding their conduct and the nature of their relationship. The words struck me like physical blows, driving the air from my lungs and setting my heart to racing like a trapped bird's. Around me, my fellow brothers began murmuring in shock and dismay, their faces turning toward where I knelt with expressions ranging from disbelief to barely concealed condemnation, but it was the abbot's face that held my attention, pale as morning frost, yet composed with the dignity that had always marked his bearing. He met my eyes across the space that separated, and in his gaze I read both sorrow for what we were about to endure, and gratitude for the love that had made the suffering worthwhile. Then he rose with fluid grace, and spoke words that would echo in my memory through all the dark days that followed. I will answer whatever questions these good officers may have, for I have lived my life in service to truth, and will not begin practicing deception now. Yet let it be known to all here present that any transgression of which I may stand accused was committed by me alone, and that Brother Thomas bears no responsibility for failures that spring from the weakness of my own flesh and spirit, my lord. "No!" I cried, scrambling to my feet despite the hands that reached out to restrain me. "Whatever we have done together, in love, and with full knowledge of our choices. I will not allow thee to bear alone the consequences of decisions we made as one." But already the officers were moving toward us, their faces impassive as death itself, and I knew that our time of stolen happiness had reached its inevitable. As they bound our hands and led us from the chapel where we had known such moments of transcendent joy, I tried to memorize every detail of the abbot's beloved face, knowing not when, or if, I would look upon it again. The trial that followed was a mockery of justice, conducted by men whose hearts had long since turned to stone beneath the weight of their own denied desires. We were kept in separate cells deep beneath the bishop's palace, cold chambers carved from living rock where dampness seeped through the walls, and the only light came from a single guttering candle replaced each dawn by silent guard. For 3 days I saw nothing of my beloved abbot, heard nothing save the distant chanting of prayers and the steady drip of water falling into unseen pools. They brought me bread that tasted of sawdust, and water that carried the metallic tang of iron, sustenance enough to keep body and soul together while they prepared their case against us. On the 4th morning, they came for me. The tribunal chamber was a hall of shadows, its vaulted ceiling lost in darkness, while torches mounted in iron brackets cast dancing light across faces that might have been carved from granite, for all the mercy they showed. Bishop Aldrich sat upon a throne-like chair at the chamber's head, his white hair gleaming beneath a jeweled mitre, his pale eyes cold as winter stars. To his right and left sat lesser prelates, whose names I knew not, though their expressions spoke eloquently of the judgment already rendered in their hearts. "Brother Thomas of Ashford," the bishop intoned, his voice echoing from the stone walls with the finality of a funeral bell, "thou dost stand accused of the gravest sins against thy holy vows and the sacred order to which thou hast pledged thy life. How dost thou answer to these charges?" I raised my chin with what dignity remained to me, though my wrists bore the marks of iron shackles and my habit hung in tatters from the rough handling of guards who cared nothing for the respect once accorded to my religious state. "My lord bishop, I confess freely that I have loved where the law forbids, yet I maintain that love itself cannot be sin, regardless of the form it takes or the obstacles placed before it." A ripple of shock passed through the assembled clerics at this bold declaration, and I heard the scratch of quills as scribes recorded my words for posterity to judge. Bishop Aldrich's face remained impassive, though I caught the slightest tightening around his eyes that suggested my defiance had not passed unnoticed. "Love, thou dost call it?" he said, his voice carrying a contempt that cut deeper than any blade. "We have heard testimony from Brother Simon that speaks of midnight meetings in gardens, of embraces stolen in sacred places, of kisses exchanged where holy vessels rest. Tell us, Brother Thomas, what manner of love requires such secrecy, such deception, such violation of the very spaces consecrated to God's service?" Heat rose in my cheeks at this recitation of our most intimate moments, transformed by hostile telling into something sordid and shameful. Yet I would not allow their interpretation to stand unchallenged, not when the memory of those blessed encounters remained bright as jewels in the treasure house of my heart. "The secrecy was born of necessity, not shame," I replied, my voice growing stronger as I found my courage. "We knew well that the world would not understand what passed between us, would not recognize the sacred nature of a bond that transcended the boundaries of flesh, to touch the very essence of our souls. Yet I swear before God and this assembly that every moment we shared was marked by reverence, by tenderness, by a quality of devotion that would not shame the holiest altar." "Blasphemy!" The word exploded from one of the lesser bishops, a thin man with eyes like burning coals. "To speak of such perversion as sacred, to dare invoke God's name in defense of acts that cry to heaven for vengeance. What further proof need we of this wretch's corruption?" "Peace. Brother Augustine," Bishop Aldrich said mildly, raising one pale hand to silence the outburst. "Let us hear what more our penitent brother has to say in defense of his actions. Tell us, Thomas, what of thy vows of chastity?" What of thy promise to renounce all earthly affections in favor of divine love alone? This was the question I had dreaded most. For how could I explain that my love for the abbot had seemed to deepen rather than diminish my connection to the divine? How could these men, who had likely never known a moment's genuine passion in their carefully ordered lives, understand that in his arms I had felt closer to God's presence than in all my years of orthodox worship? I do not ask forgiveness for loving, I said at last, my voice steady though my heart hammered against my ribs like a caged bird seeking freedom. If my vows are broken, they are broken in service to a truth greater than any human law or custom. When I held him in my arms, when I looked into his eyes and saw my own soul reflected, I felt the presence of divine love made manifest in earthly form. How can such experience be counted as sin? The silence that greeted these words was profound, stretching until I began to wonder if I had shocked even these hardened judges into speechlessness. Then Bishop Aldrich leaned forward in his great chair, his pale eyes fixed upon my face with an intensity that seemed to pierce straight through to my quaking soul. "And what of thy superior in this corruption?" he asked softly. "What of the man charged with guiding thy spiritual development, who instead led thee into paths of damnation? Surely thou must see that his crime is greater than thine, his responsibility more grave?" Here was the trap I had feared they would set, the attempt to drive wedges between us that might serve their purposes of punishment and control. They sought to make me betray my beloved, to purchase my own salvation with testimony that would condemn the man who had shown me the face of paradise. "Abbot Matthias is guilty of nothing save returning love that was freely offered," I declared, my voice ringing clear in the stone chamber. "If there be leadership in our actions, it came from my heart that would not be denied its desire. If there be corruption, it springs from my soul that recognized in his presence something worth any earthly sacrifice. He is innocent of all save loving me, and for that I will gladly bear whatever punishment you deem fit." "Touching," Bishop Aldrich observed, though his tone suggested anything but appreciation for my loyalty, "yet misguided. We have heard from the abbot's own lips a confession of his part in these proceedings, have listened to his acknowledgement of responsibility for leading astray one placed in his spiritual. Think you that such noble self-sacrifice will go unmarked when sentences are pronounced?" The words struck me like physical blows, for I had hoped against hope that my beloved might find some way to escape the consequence of our love, might craft some defense that would preserve his position, if not his happiness. To learn that he had confessed, had accepted responsibility that rightfully belonged to both of us, filled me with anguish almost beyond bearing. "What sentence have you pronounced upon him?" I whispered, dreading the answer yet needing to know what fate awaited the man who had become more precious to me than life itself. "That is not thy concern," the bishop replied coldly. "Thy focus should be upon thy own soul's salvation, upon the penance required to cleanse thee of these grievous sins. We offer thee one final opportunity to renounce these perverse affections, to beg God's forgiveness and pledge thyself to a life of true chastity and obedience. Wilt thou accept this mercy, or must we proceed to more severe measures?" I closed my eyes and tried to imagine the life they offered, a return to the hollow observances that had once satisfied me, a pretense of normalcy built upon the grave of the deepest love I would ever know. The prospect filled me with such despair that I wondered if death might not be preferable to such existence. "I cannot renounce what has become the very foundation of my being," I said at last, opening my eyes to meet the bishop's frigid stare. "To deny my love for Abbot Matthias would be to deny the truest thing I have ever known, to reject the gift that taught me what divine love might feel like when clothed in human form. If this be obstinacy, so be it. If this be sin, then I choose damnation over the hell of living without love." The judgment that followed was swift and merciless. I was stripped of my religious habit, my tonsure allowed to grow out until no trace remained of my former consecrated state. They sentenced me to exile from all religious houses, forbade me to enter any church or chapel, declared me excommunicate from the body of the faithful. Yet even as they pronounced these words that were meant to break my spirit, I felt a strange sense of liberation, as though in losing everything I had gained something far more precious. They could take from me my vows, my home, my place in the community that had sheltered me since boyhood, but they could not touch the love that burned bright and eternal in my heart. As the guards prepared to lead me from the chamber, I dared one final question. "What of Abbot Matthias? What judgment have you rendered upon him?" Bishop Aldrich's smile was cold as winter dawn. "The former abbot has been remanded to the monastery of St. Jerome in the northern mountain, there to spend his remaining days in contemplation of his sins. He will speak to none, touch none, know nothing of the world beyond those walls until death claims him. Think upon this, Thomas of Ashford, when thou dost lie in whatever gutter will receive thee. Think upon the man whose destruction thou hast wrought with thy selfish desires. The words were meant to crush me with guilt, to poison the memory of our love with the bitter taste of responsibility for his suffering. Yet even as they echoed in my ears, I heard beneath their cruelty a note of hope that set my pulse to racing. He lived. Whatever punishment they had decreed, whatever exile they had imposed, he lived, and where there was life, there remained the possibility of love finding a way. They cast me from the bishop's palace as the sun reached its zenith, my few possessions bundled in a cloth sack, my feet bare upon the cobblestones that stretched away toward horizons unknown. Behind me, the great doors clanged shut with the finality of a tomb ceiling, cutting me off forever from the world that had shaped my youth. Yet as I stood there in the marketplace, buffeted by curious stares and whispered speculation, I felt no despair, for I carried within my heart a treasure no earthly power could steal, the memory of love freely given and fully received, the knowledge that somewhere in this wide world lived the other half of my soul. The months that followed tested my resolve in ways I had never imagined. Cast out from the only life I had known, forbidden the comfort of religious community, I wandered like a ghost through villages and towns where none would give shelter to an excommunicated monk. I labored for bread in fields and workshop, slept beneath stars when no roof would cover me, endured the scorn of those who saw in my disgrace a confirmation of their own righteousness. Yet through all these trials, I held fast to the love that had become my religion, my philosophy, my reason for drawing breath each morning. In quiet moments between labors, I would close my eyes and remember the warmth of his embrace, the sound of his voice speaking my name like a prayer, the way candlelight had played across his features in our stolen moments together. I began to make careful inquiries about the monastery of St. Jerome, learning its location through conversations with merchants and pilgrims, studying the mountain paths that led to its remote location. The place was said to be a fortress of silence, a repository for those whom the church wished to forget. Yet I began to conceive a plan so audacious it might have been born of madness. Winter deepened, and with it my resolve hardened, like iron tested in flame. I used what little coin I could earn to purchase supplies, rough clothing suitable for mountain travel, dried provisions that would keep flesh and bone together through long nights of cold, a knife and tinderbox that might mean the difference between life and death in the wilderness. When spring began to stir in the valleys, and the first flowers dared show their faces to the sun, I set out upon the path that would lead me either to reunion or to death in the attempt. The monastery of St. Jerome lay 7 days' journey through mountain passes, where few men dared travel. Yet I would have walked 7 times 7 days for the chance to look upon my beloved's face once more. The monastery, when at last I reached it, proved as forbidding as its reputation suggested. Built upon a pinnacle of stone that rose like God's own finger toward heaven, its walls seemed carved from the living rock itself. No road led to its gates, only a treacherous path that wound around cliff faces where one misstep would mean a fall of hundreds of feet to the jagged stones below. I spent 3 days watching from concealment, learning the rhythms of its daily life, observing the movements of its few inhabitants. The brothers who dwelt there moved like shadows, speaking to none, their faces hidden beneath deep cowls that rendered them anonymous as death itself. Yet on the 3rd evening, as sunset painted the peaks in shades of gold and crimson, I saw him. He stood upon a narrow balcony that jutted from the monastery's highest tower, his form silhouetted against the dying light, and though distance rendered his features indistinct, my heart recognized him instantly. Even here, in this place of punishment and exile, he carried himself with the dignity that had first drawn my admiration, the quiet strength that had sustained me through our darkest hours. That night, I scaled the cliff face that rose beneath his tower, my fingers finding purchase on cracks so narrow they barely accommodated the tips of my digits, my feet seeking holds that would support my weight long enough to reach the next handhold. More than once I hung suspended over the abyss, with nothing but faith and desperate love to keep me from falling. Yet somehow I reached the balcony where he took the evening air. He turned at the sound of my approach, and in the moonlight I saw his face cycle through disbelief, joy, and terror so quickly that all three seemed to occupy the same instant. Then he was in my arms, his body pressed against mine with desperate hunger, tears streaming down his cheeks as he whispered my name like a litany of praise. Thomas, my beloved, my heart's desire. He breathed against my throat, his hands fisting in my rough traveling clothes as though he would never let me go. How is it possible? How dost thou come to be here when I believed thee lost forever to the world's cruelty? Love finds a way, I replied simply, holding him as close as 2 souls could be held while still clothed in flesh. No distance could keep me from thee, no punishment could diminish what burns eternal between us. I have come to take thee from this place, to find some corner of the world where we might live as what we truly are. He pulled back to study my face in the pale light, his own features marked by months of privation and sorrow, yet still beautiful beyond measure to my love-blinded eyes. They watch me constantly, he warned. The smallest deviation from routine is noted, the slightest breach of silence punished with days of solitary confinement. Even now, should we be discovered, then we must not be discovered, I said, pressing my lips to his forehead in blessing and benediction both. I have studied this place for days, have learned its weaknesses as well as its strengths. Before dawn breaks, we can be away from here, lost among the mountain paths where none will think to follow. And go where? He asked, though I could see in his eyes the growing flame of hope that matched my own. What sanctuary exists for such as we? What place will receive those whom the Church has cast out? I know of a valley beyond the great peaks, a place where hermits dwell who care nothing for the politics of bishops and abbots, I replied. There we might build a simple, might know the peace of existing without fear or shame. We would have little save each other, but when has love ever needed more? He was silent for a long moment, weighing the risks of flight against the certainty of continued imprisonment, the possibility of happiness against the safety of accepted suffering. Then he smiled, the first true smile I had seen from him since that terrible morning of our capture, and I knew his decision before he spoke. I will come, he whispered. God help me, but I will come, for I have learned in these months of separation that a life without love is no life at all, but merely existence in the shadow of what might have been. We gathered what few possessions he dared take. A small book of prayers his captors had allowed him to keep, the simple cross that had been his father's, bread saved from that evening's meager meal. Then, with the moon riding high above peaks crowned with eternal snow, we began our descent from that place of punishment toward whatever future awaited two souls bound together by love stronger than death. The journey that followed tested every skill I had learned by months of wandering, every reserve of strength and endurance that love could provide. We traveled by night when possible, hiding during daylight hours in caves and hollows where pursuit might not find us. We ate what the wilderness provided, berries and nuts, herbs and roots, occasionally a fish caught in the swift mountain streams that tumbled toward distant valleys. My beloved bore these hardships with the same quiet dignity he had brought to all his trials, never complaining of cold or hunger, finding beauty in stars reflected in still pools and strength in the pressure of my hand holding his, as we navigated treacherous paths. In those nights when we huddled together for warmth, when the howling of wolves echoed from distant ridges and death seemed near as the next misstep, we knew a happiness more complete than any palace could have provided. On the 7th day of our flight, we crested a final ridge and looked down upon the valley I had promised, a green sanctuary cupped between towering peaks, watered by streams that ran silver in the morning light, dotted with the simple dwellings of those who had chosen solitude over the complexities of the world below. Is it real? He whispered beside me, his voice filled with wonder, as he gazed upon this promised land that had sustained us through the darkest hours of our escape. After so much sorrow, so much fear, can such peace truly exist? As real as the love that brought us here, I replied, turning to capture his face between my hands, to kiss him with all the passion that months of separation and days of shared danger had intensified beyond measure. As real as the life we shall build together in this place, where none shall judge us save God himself. We descended into that valley as the sun climbed toward its zenith, our footsteps light with joy, our hearts singing hymns of gratitude for deliverance beyond hope or merit. The hermits who dwelt there received us with the simple courtesy of those who understood that every soul carried burdens visible and hidden, asking no questions about our past while offering what small welcome their sparse reach. We built our dwelling in a grove of ancient pines, a simple structure of stone and timber that would shelter us from winter's fury, while opening toward the valley's heart, where wildflowers painted the meadows in colors bright as stained glass windows. There we lived as husband and wife in all but name, tending a garden where vegetables grew beside healing herbs, offering what aid we could to our fellow hermits when illness or injury struck their small community. The years passed like pages in an illuminated manuscript, each season bringing its own beauty, its own challenges met and overcome together. We grew older in that place, our hair touched with silver, our faces marked by sun and wind and the deep contentment of love. Sometimes, in winter nights when wind howled through the peaks and firelight danced across the walls of our small home, we would speak of the life we had left behind, of brothers who had shared our prayers and labors in that world that seemed now distant as a dream. Yet we felt no regret for the choices that had brought us to this sanctuary, no sorrow for the conventional sanctity we had traded for a more personal form of devotion. Our love had become our religion, our our daily life together a prayer more profound than any we had offered in chapel or cathedral. In each other's arms, we had found the presence we had sought through all our years of formal worship. The sense of divine love made manifest that no earthly authority could validate, condemn. As I write these words by candlelight, my beloved sleeping peacefully beside me after 40 years of shared exile, I marvel at the journey that brought us to this place of unexpected grace. We who were cast out as sinners have found in each other a holiness more authentic than any we knew in our religious houses. We who were condemned for loving have discovered that love itself is the truest sacrament, requiring no priest to consecrate it, no authority to bless what God has already sanctified in the secret chambers of the heart. The Church may count us among the lost. The world may judge us as souls damned by our own desires. Yet I know with certainty born of long experience that we have found our paradise not despite our love, but because of it. In choosing each other over the approval of men, we chose the narrow gate that leads to life abundant, the path less traveled that winds through suffering toward joy. If this tale hath touched thy heart, gentle reader, leave thy appreciation here below. Subscribe to hear more such chronicle, and share thy thoughts in the comments that follow. To hear the next narrative of love triumphant, click ye upon the box to thy left, where other stories of passion and redemption await thy discovery.